Hey, I wanted to talk about loneliness in Susanna Clarke's 2020 fantasy novel, Paranisi. Um, this isn't a review of this fantasy novel, which opens in this strange labyrinthian world where there's this one character, Paranisi, who is doesn't really have any memory of what's happened in his life before, and is very isolated, very alone. There's only one person at the beginning of the book that he has had any interaction with for what seems like years and years. And yeah, this isn't me reviewing the book so much as kind of examining that idea of isolation and loneliness and what it can do to someone, and how it seems to me that Susanna Clarke has really hit upon, um, in this is a fantasy novel. There's kind of this magical element for it. This is not the world. This is not our world. This is another world, very much a C.S. Lewis world. As you discover, as you read this book, and maybe if you've read The Magician's Apprentice by C.S. Lewis, his it's chronologically the first book in the Narnia series, but he wrote it. It's a prequel that he wrote like sixth in the line of the stuff, and is actually kind of a favorite of mine. But um, aside from that, is this idea of how this is like one of these really great books, fantasy books, where it isn't actually a fantasy thing. It's using fantasy language and a fantasy situation to very much express what I think is something that is very much going on right now in the world. There's in a sense that I am a Paranisi, that I see many other Paranisis online, uh, in the world, uh, on the bus, as it were. Um, so yeah, he is now a part of the kind of the characteristic of this world is that it seems to have it has an effect on the human mind. It makes them forget what has happened in the past. It makes them Paranisi retains, language. He writes in journals. He's got knowledge, but the other, who only kind of appears periodically, will casually drop a place name, an English place name, and he'll be like, "What's that? That's obviously made up. You obviously dropped that into the conversation. Is it Manchester or something like that? You just dropped that in the conversation to test me, to see if I didn't notice that that's just you're using a nonsense word." And I mean, as readers, we know that's not a nonsense word, but yeah, it's affected his mind in that he has forgotten things. He has forgotten his childhood. He's forgotten his life entirely before. He can explore around. That's what he does. That's what the other. That's the only name he has for this fellow. Once you find out his name, you really start making the connections to the Magician's Apprentice. Is He's got all those skills, a kind of documenting, recording, mapping, sort of stuff like that. This strange labyrinthine, all these halls that are flooded at the bottom, but he doesn't have uh, that past life, and it's one of these things that makes me think about what makes a human being, and like what makes our identity. And I think a part of what makes our identity is the relationships that we have with the people in our lives. That's I've got my partner, her mother, um, you know um, relatives, co-workers. It all kind of builds this sort of identity of who I am. Um, and if that was all taken away from me, and the world, the particular surroundings was in, was taken away from me, and I was plopped somewhere like where Paranisi is right now, um, there is, in a sense, that you get that I think, given enough, like give me a decade of being in that kind of a situation, um, perhaps like, in a prison system where you're locked in a cell for years and years and years in isolation, that can really screw up a person's mind. And I would get very much the sense it would have a very similar, my imagining of is Piranesi is sort of a fantasy imagining of what happens to people in that situation, what we do as a society to people in that situation now, because Piranesi is very much a prisoner. It turns out in this story, and it makes me think about the prisoners that we have in our own world. But like, I mean, I don't think you even have to go as extreme as that, as like someone who is like is in a prison in isolation. I think you can see that with a lot of people today whose social groups are smaller and smaller and smaller, until there's lots of people who just don't have a social group, or only have maybe one person, or one person that finds them, which is what happens to Piranesi. He is someone who is completely alone, but there is one person who knows him, who actually names him, who gives him a task to do. And that really makes me think of people who are very isolated and alone, who get preyed on by others, who for their own purposes say, you will be useful to me, I will give you a task to do, and in exchange I will interact with you. And the kind of the power that has for someone who is totally alone, that how much that just like that how much overwhelming influence that has, that you can end up shaping someone. You can determine how they think because they are so alone in their own way. I think there's a whole kind of generation of people who have been in that state and have been radicalized in various different ways for various different causes, left, right, all that, by people who they're not there. They exchange their companionship for power over them, for their own personal aggrandization, for their own financial wealth. People, there's lots of people who run stuff that's like basically, hi, I'm going to be your professional friend. You just pay me for it, and they do make a very good living out of that. And that can sometimes be very benign. That can be just, I like Star Trek, and I watch someone, and I give some money to their Patreon, and I mean I'm clear about where my personal boundaries are, and I know I don't have a relationship with them, but I can see other people who it's like that's the only thing they have, and that becomes kind of the center of their life, and maybe that just all becomes more Star Trek stuff. It doesn't become anything further than that, but there is definitely cases where it is more. And so it's just one of these, it's one of these things where Piranesi is like, oh, this is very much expressing something in a fantasy setting, based on a C.S. Lewis kind of novel that really taps into kind of an amnesia that people have about themselves, of losing themselves, and of also, unfortunately, finding anchors that aren't particularly healthy, that are selfish anchors out there, and as kind of also maybe a case of someone coming. I'm not going to get into Piranesi, but also Piranesi is an interesting book when you look at it as someone who finds themselves again, and of resilience that way, which makes it it's a bittersweet book. It's like someone who's lost decades of their life, but also someone who does make it out not unscathed out the other side. I mean, I think that's the other thing, that Susanna Clarke is realistic in this book, of like there's a lot of us are are have our damages from losing ourselves, from losing those connections, and it can happening at a young enough age that can really have a lasting thing, but it is not the end of the world. So yeah, those are my thoughts on loneliness, isolation, in as expressed by a fantasy novel, Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I don't know if you've read it, whether that was what came up for you, or if it's all the C.S. Lewis stuff. That's God. That's a whole other rabbit hole. I might just I'll probably just do a whole video on that, of just like, it's all the C.S. Lewis stuff in this book, which is it is interesting. It's interesting. You get the fan fiction of Tolkien or the fan fiction of C.S. Lewis, and actually, I kind of think I guess all fantasy is a lot of giant swath of fantasy is Tolkien, but there's a nice little subset of C.S. Lewis fan fiction or riffs on or inspirations of, which I'm also here for. All right, I will leave it there. More videos later before I launch into that video.